Altair, Apple Floppy Days, Commodore, Tandy Floppy Days, Atari, TI Floppy Days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC Floppy Days, ST Amiga Floppy Days, Junior Sinclair Floppy Days, Classic Days, Microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64.
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari.
It's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3.
Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s, the Commodore VIC-20.
Hello and welcome to episode 127 for June 2023 of the Floppy Days Podcast with your host, yours truly, Randy Kindig. I doubt there are few listeners who don't know the name Paul Terrell. Paul has been credited with essentially jump-starting the personal computer industry in many ways, not the least of which was buying the original Apple I computer from the just getting started Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and selling it in his equally famous computer store, the Byte Shop. This was the first personal computer retail store in existence. Paul was also a member of the legendary Homebrew Computer Club and attended the West Coast Computer Faire. He was involved in the development of both the Exidy Sorcerer and BYT-8 computers, and he later went on to start ComputerMania Inc, which was a chain of computer stores created with the purpose of renting computers and software. This guy has had an amazing career, and I am truly honored to be able to bring you a series of interviews with Paul for the podcast. Paul and I will be covering his entire career from his early beginnings through the Byte Shop years and his time with the nascent Apple computer and beyond. This first segment is a sort of overview leading up to Paul's time involved with Exidy and the Exidy Sorcerer computer. You'll hear a bit about Bill Gates, the early Micro-Soft, the Byte Shop, the early Apple, the Homebrew Computer Club, the West Coast Computer Faire, and a whole lot more. Later episodes will be focused primarily on a single topic, such as the Sorcerer, the Byte Shop, etc. Paul first contacted me after the interview I had with Hal Ivey and Hal's involvement and remembrances of the Exidy Sorcerer. He really liked Hal's interview and wanted to add a few details and give his perspective on the Sorcerer. As we talked further, Paul decided he would really like to be able to talk about his incredible career in its entirety, more than just the time with Exidy, and I, of course, was ecstatic that he decided my humble podcast could be a good medium for that. I really hope you enjoy this series in general, and this short episode should give you a taste of things to come. Before we do that, I wanted to briefly mention the show sponsors. Without these people, there might not be a podcast. First up is 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts. It's a great place to get vintage computer items, such as video cables, power supplies, PC boards, cartridges, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often talk about 8bitclassics.com, when I talk about new acquisitions each month. Corey has been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out the site. He has some great stuff. ArcadeShopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, is another terrific site to get vintage computer items. Greg has a wide variety of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site that I do and have done a lot of shopping at, and have mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If you're there, anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form, and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through Patreon.com. This includes Gary Heather, Tony Capolini, Chris Petzel, Lawrence, Richard Goldstone, Brendan Donahue, Josh Malone, Simon McCullough, Andy Collins, Jason Moore, Ost, and Quentin Barnes. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Okay, let's move on with the show.
Hi, I'm Stuart Chaffee, host and executive producer of the Computer Chronicles television series. You're listening to me on the Floppy Days Podcast, hosted by Randy Kindig.
Okay, now for our new acquisitions and what I've been up to, which has been quite a bit on both fronts. First thing I want to talk about is recently a friend of mine in the community, James Shackel, passed away. James was a good friend of the show as well, and we were in contact quite often talking about some aspect of vintage computing. When he passed in February of this year, I was shocked and dismayed. I had just seen James in early October last year at Tandy Assembly, and he had never even told me he was sick. I truly will miss my friend, our conversations, and his singular humor. I just wanted to remind everyone not to take their health for granted. James was in his 50s, was a runner, always had been healthy, and yet was taken from this earth far too soon. A simple diagnostic test could have discovered his issue much sooner, and James might still be with us. Please take care of yourself and see a doctor regularly. Now I'll get on with the story here. I was even more surprised when James' wife, Jean, contacted me and told me that James had willed much of his computer collection to me and the show. He had willed his Apple collection, both the Apple II and the Mac, to another friend, his TI-99 collection to yet another friend, and the remainder to me. James and I had done some swapping in the past, and James had donated items such as books to the show. For instance, a couple of years ago, I had traded a ZX Spectrum Plus 2A to James for a Tippy, which is a storage, network, and device expansion for the TI-99 using a Raspberry Pi. Most recently, in fact just since the October Tandy Assembly show and February when he passed, I had traded a Commodore 128 with a 1571 drive to James for a very nice Atari 1200 XL. On that last topic, I just wanted to share a short story that I found strange in all this. I mentioned that James had sent me the 1200 XL while in the last few months of his life. Again, I didn't even know he was sick. Anyway, I had let the machine sit, not even opening the box, until sometime in March, even though I had received it at the end of October. Got just too many machines and too many projects. I finally opened the box in March and found the beautiful 1200 XL with new keyboard Mylar that James had just installed before shipping, as well as a personal note and a copy of the movie Hoosiers on DVD. James knew I was in Indiana, where basketball was king. He was always doing things like this. He even included a folder with documentation on the fixes he had done to the machine, like the keyboard Mylar. I immediately sat down at my computer, sent James a text thanking him for all of it and asking him a question. I frankly was a bit surprised that he didn't quickly respond, but he was a pilot, so he was a busy guy. The weird thing about this story, and the reason I'm telling you this, is what happened next. That evening, I was checking my mail and social media while with the family watching TV, and I received an email from another friend saying that he had heard that someone in the community had recently died. He knew that I knew this person and wanted to send his condolences. That's how I found out that James had died a few weeks earlier. I was totally shocked and unbelievably saddened by this. That's the story I wanted to share. Again, it just seemed so strange to me that I found out he had passed the exact same day I had chosen to open the package he had sent me after it had sat for months, and I had sent him a text that very same day. Before continuing my update, another quick memory of James. I actually first met James when he first came to one of the Indie Vintage Computer Club meetings probably 3 or so years ago. I mentioned that he was a pilot. He arranged things so that when he flew into Indy one Saturday, while waiting for his next flight, he came over to the club meeting to join us for the day. That particular day, I had brought in my TI-99 and had just acquired an F-18A upgrade for it. The F-18A is a video upgrade that allows you to get crisp VGA output from your TI-99, but does require some installation. James was first and foremost a TI-99 guy, so he did most of the heavy lifting in terms of installing the F-18A. He then later took me and my son out to lunch after the meeting. That was my first in-person encounter with James, and we were good friends from that point forward. To continue the story with James's wife after his passing, I mentioned she had contacted me about willing much of his collection to me. Now, even though James and I had communicated often, I really didn't have a good perspective at all concerning how large and eclectic his collection was. I actually assumed it was fairly small, with a few TIs and their accessories, and then a few other computers. It turns out I was very wrong on that. Jean told me it was a very large collection, and she wasn't even sure how much was there, nor what much of it was. In fact, she was looking for help identifying a lot of it. Jean was kind enough to take several pictures of some of the stuff, and I was blown away. It was obvious that James collected far more vintage computer and vintage gaming stuff than I had any idea about. My wife and I were looking to plan a trip where we would do something we hadn't done before. This turned out to be a great opportunity to do just that. We made plans to fly out to the Phoenix area where Jean and James lived, rent a larger vehicle, such as an SUV, pack items to bring back to Indiana, and then drive along the famous Route 66 back home, taking our time to do so. This would allow us to stop and see things along the route home and enjoy the trip. The only caveat to all of this is that from all appearances, I was going to have to be selective in what I brought back, as there was only so much cubic feet of storage in an SUV, even with the back seats down, and it was expensive to rent something larger. This was going to be hard. When we got to James' home, Jean was there to meet us. After introductions and condolences, Jean took us to the upstairs office/bedroom area that was James's man cave. I was blown away by the amount of stuff he had and how disorganized much of it was. There was a large bed in the middle of the room that was totally covered with items. There were piles of books laying on the floor, and there were numerous other boxes of computers and computer items all around the room. It took on the order of 5 hours to work my way through the stuff. It was very difficult to be selective, knowing I had a limited space in which to store the items while driving back home. Items that were not rare, or that I already had and didn't care to have duplicates of, I left there. In a few cases, I left things that I didn't have a lot of interest in favor of things for which I did have more interest. I was particularly selective with books, as James had quite a few, and I only took those books which I didn't have and which I really coveted for my collection. This was less due to limited storage space in the vehicle than limited space for more computer books at home. In any event, we finally filled up the rental with the most coveted items and still had room to get in our luggage and see out the back window. I wanted to mention that Jean was an amazing hostess. She was very friendly and seemed happy to get help in organizing and reducing the large volume of stuff. For the items that I left, I gave her some tips on what they were and the approximate value for some of them. As we parted, I made it clear that she could contact me any time for help identifying and valuing anything in the collection. I believe she was planning to use eBay to get rid of a lot of the remaining items. I should note that I was the last of the 3 people to which James had willed his collection to go through it. So when I got there, all the TI and Apple stuff had already been picked out. And yet, it was still a very large collection of computer and gaming items. Anyway, in case Jean is listening, I really want to thank her again for opening up her home to a stranger to come and pick things out from her late husband's estate. She was very nice, generous, and hospitable. Thank you, Jean. We spent 5 days driving the 1,600 plus miles back to Indiana. That was really nice because it gave us the opportunity to stop at sites, flea markets, and restaurants along the way. Much of the trip was on Highway 40, which paralleled or encompassed the famous old Route 66, on which we had never traveled. Some things we were able to see along the way included the meteor crater near Winslow, Arizona, highlighted in the movie Starman, and the petrified forest in Arizona. We traveled through the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Illinois, all the while with a carload of vintage computer items in the back. One scary moment did occur when we spent the night in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Of course, Oklahoma is known for tornadoes. On the night we stayed there, just after midnight, a storm alert came up on our phones, and 100-mile-per-hour winds were moving through. We endured the high winds for the next hour or so and lost power in the hotel through the remainder of our stay there. Suffice it to say, we got up in the morning, we were unable to take a shower, grabbed our stuff, and hightailed it down the road. Luckily, the vehicle and its contents were undamaged. There was a lot of evidence of the high winds, with some trees down and shingles all over the parking lot from the hotel roof, but no large-scale damage was visible, thank goodness. So, just to give you an idea of the things that were in the collection, again, this is just a high-level view. I still haven't had the opportunity to go through everything I brought home in detail to detail it all out, but I will follow up later and give you more details. But in general, I did pick up essentially 13 computers. There was an Atari 800XL, 2 Atari 600XLs, an Atari XEGS, a Commodore 128 with 1571 drive, an Amiga 500, an Atari 1040 STE, a Commodore SX64 portable, the Tandy Model 4D, the Commodore 1084 monitor, a Tandy CM5 monitor, a Commodore Plus 4, a Tandy Model 100, a Sinclair ZX Spectrum Plus 2A that I mentioned before that I had traded to James, a Tandy Coco 3, a Commodore 64, and a Vectrex that was pimped out much better than the one that I currently have and that I got from the barn find. Oh, and a Tomy Tutor, which is a machine that I always had an interest in, always wanted to own, and so that was in the collection as well. I got some modern upgrades. Again, I don't have all the details there, but there was an Atari Max 5200 multicard, an Ultra Satan for the Atari ST, a Commodore 64 SD to IEC, a C64 Kung Fu flash cart, which I don't know a ton about yet. Some other things that I got, a desoldering gun, which I needed and did not have, an Arduino kit, some Atari 5200 carts, some Atari 5200 controllers, some Vectrex carts, so an Apple II 64K 80-column card, thanks to Brian Weiser, who was the Apple guy that got all the Apple stuff. But when I told him I needed a new 64K 80-column card for my Apple II, he left one for me, and a TR-74 calculator and printer. On the book front, I did bring back lots of Atari ST books, an Apple II assembly lines book, TI-99 fourth book, C64 retro reproduction books, and some recent C64 development books. Some stuff that I left behind, either because I already had them or I just felt like I didn't have room in favor of other things. There were 4 Atari 5200s. I really had no idea that James was so much into the 5200, but apparently he must have been, because again, there were 4 different machines there. An Atari 7800, a Sears Arcade, which is the Atari 2600, a ColecoVision and a television, a Tandy Model 1000, a Tandy Model 2500, an arcade coffee table with asteroids, which was too large. I really wanted to bring that back, but I just didn't have room. A 1702 monitor, and as I mentioned, many books that I didn't bring. Some things were in a state of disassembly. He was clearly in the middle of doing some upgrades. Most notable was a very nice Tandy Model 4D that it appears he was in the process of adding a Fred to. It's going to take a lot of work to finish that installation, find all the correct screws for the machine, and put it back together. I grabbed all of the plastic bags with screws in them on his bench in the hope that I have all the pieces to the machine to get it reassembled. The Commodore 128 and Amiga 500 computers were also apart, had their covers off, although it appears just the case screws were removed, so shouldn't be too much of a problem to get those back together. There's definitely some work to do, but I'd like to continue James's legacy and finish the Tandy 4D for him. I want to thank James for leaving me and the podcast his collection. I'm honored that he chose to leave them to me, and I really want to honor his memory by finding good homes for those items that I don't decide to keep. James, my friend, I will miss you and will remember you. Okay, the next item I wanted to discuss on the topic of what I've been up to is the organization of my collection that's occurring. I think this is probably something that for many of you is something that's also on your mind. You know, how do you organize it? How do you keep it organized? How do you keep it from getting out of control? And the passing of James and the thought of leaving my fairly large collection to my wife to deal with someday was kind of sobering, actually. While I had some computers displayed on bookshelves and around my office/man cave, I still had issues, right? They were constantly getting dusty, even though I had cover for some of the machines. And they looked messy because I had modern upgrades and peripherals just sitting out with the computer displays. I have to give a lot of credit to my wife for, one, being tolerant of my vintage computer collecting, which certainly can't be easy at times, and two, always thinking of better ways to organize and display this stuff. I made a decision some time ago that I didn't want a majority of my computers sitting in a closet where they were a pain to get out to use and couldn't be seen by myself or guests to our home. It was her idea for me to use some bookshelves installed in my office to display some of those machines. However, there never was enough display space, and as I mentioned, the displays were messy and always getting dusty. It was her idea to go a different route. She felt a good way to go would be to acquire some display cases, as you might see at a flea market or store, to house the machines. That would allow displaying them while keeping the dust off of them. In addition, we could buy separate small cabinets with multiple drawers to house the peripherals, cords, etc., and have a nice clean display in the display case with just a computer. And yet, I would have quick access to the peripherals and cords when needed. We found some glass door display cases that were perfect for sale at a local antique mall. They were old and scratched, but her intent was to paint them with complementary colors to the computer furniture I already had in the office. We also found some fairly small wood cabinets at Hobby Lobby with 20 drawers each. Those also would be repainted to match the other computer furniture. In my office, there are built-in bookcases that cover most of the end wall. It's great for the large collection of books I had. At one point, I had my books well organized, but over the years, or the last couple of years particularly, they had gotten scattered and disorganized as I added to the number of books that I had. I also had not cataloged my books, which always was an issue when I went to computer shows, and I was never sure which books I already had. On occasion, I had gotten duplicates as a result. So I tore out the entire collection of computer books and reorganized and took photos of all of them. I'll then use the photos to catalog the books in some sort of cloud-based database. Not sure exactly what I'll use yet, but probably Google Sheets. Now, not only are the books arranged by platform, but there's also a little bit of room for growth for each platform. Not much, but a little. To date, the display cases have been painted and moved into the room. I've filled them with the computers I want to display and have room for more computers than I did before because these cases are actually a little bit wider. The cabinets with drawers have been painted, but we're waiting on the label accommodating pulls for the drawers to get it finished. It's great to have things more organized, but there's a lot more work to do to get them cataloged. I'm looking forward to having this complete, both for insurance purposes and for the peace of mind knowing that things will be more organized for my wife should something happen to me. I'll keep you guys updated on the podcast and post pictures as things progress on this. Finally, I wanted to give you guys an update on the Osborne ones that I talked about in episode 126. If you recall, the first Osborne one that I tested worked fine. There were 3 Osbornes in the barn find, 2 Osborne ones and an Osborne executive. Again, that first Osborne one that I tested worked fine until the capacitor blew and it started smoking. So I bought a couple of cap kits made specifically for the Osborne one from a site called console5.com. I posted to our local computer club, the IVCC, that I needed to recap the Osborne, and the group jumped right in and told me to bring it to the next club meeting and we'd work on it. Sure enough, I took it to the May meeting, and Lige Hensley, host of the Commodore Room YouTube channel, used his desoldering tool and soldering skills to replace every single capacitor on the power board out of this kit. Once he was done, it fired right up without smoking. Another Osborne one saved. I will say that I learned a lot from watching Lige recap the computer and firmly believe I could do it myself on the next one with the right equipment. Luckily, one of the things I got from James's collection was a nice desoldering gun, so I just need to learn how to properly use it and then practice up on my soldering. Thanks again to Lige for recapping, and to the rest of the club members for lending a hand as well. It's great to have a group of people like that who are willing to help each other. And that's it for what I've been up to and new acquisitions this month.
This is Michael Tomczyk. I've been called the marketing father of the home computer, and you're listening to the Floppy Days broadcast.
Okay, now for upcoming shows. Even though we're at mid-year here, in fact, exactly at mid-year, this being recorded on June 30th, there's still a lot of shows left in the second half of the year. I mean, a lot of shows, both in the United States as well as abroad. So if you can make a show, please try to do so. First up, the Kickstart Amiga UK Expo. Very imminent, July 1st through the 2nd in Nottingham, UK. Kansas Fest is going to run, it's going to have two components to it this year, both in-person component and a virtual component. The in-person component will be July 18th through the 23rd. The virtual component will be July 29th through the 30th. And the in-person is being held at Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri. The Southern Fried Gaming Expo and VCF Southeast, which run concurrently, are July 20th through the 30th in Atlanta, Georgia. There's an Atari Buy, Sell, Swap Trade event, August 5th, 15 miles southeast of Charlotte, North Carolina. Zap Live 2023 will be August 12th at the Holiday Inn, Kenilworth, CV8 1ED in the UK. Silly Venture Summer Edition, August 17th through the 20th in Gdansk, Poland. Fujiyama 2023 will be August 30th through September 3rd in Langenfeld, Germany. VCF Midwest, September 9th and 10th at the Waterford Banquet and Conference Center in Elmhurst, Illinois. Tandy Assembly will be September 29th through October 1st at the Courtyard by Marriott in Springfield, Ohio. Amiga 38 Germany, October 6th through the 7th. Amy West, October 14th through the 15th in Sacramento, California. The Portland Retro Gaming Expo, October 13th through the 15th at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. Chicago TI International World Fair, October 14th at the Evanston Public Library in Evanston, Illinois. The World of Commodore will be December 2nd through the 3rd at the Admiral Inn, Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. And that's it for upcoming shows in the remainder of 2023. So I'm here today with Paul Terrell. Paul was involved with many things. It's great to have you on today, Paul. I appreciate it. Why don't we kick it off by just having you tell us where you live and what you do today?
Okay. I'm Paul Terrell, and today I live in a combination of Vancouver, Washington, and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You're talking to me in my Fort Lauderdale house, and as a matter of fact, today is June 1st, which is the start of hurricane season, so I will shortly be heading out of here to the great Pacific Northwest and Vancouver.
Okay, so you get away from the hurricane season by going clear to the opposite corner of the country, huh?
Yeah, we RV back and forth, my wife and I, so we get a chance to see this wonderful country and all of its national and state parks and so forth. So
nice.
And obviously, being able to do that, my occupation basically is I'm retired. So I actually kind of officially retired back in 1989. That's when I left Silicon Valley and moved up to the Portland area, which is where my family and parents were from. And so I sort of retired out of the Valley and up to the Pacific Northwest. But of course, as we've seen over the years, Silicon Valley sort of followed me up there, and all of a sudden the Northwest became the Silicon Forest with
right.
Intel probably the largest employer in the state here now. So, but at any rate, getting back to me and Exidy and the beginning of that, I probably should introduce myself as actually being a graduate of Summit High School back in 1962. And in those days, there was such a thing called the draft, and so people had a military obligation, and I decided to join the Air Force in 1962 rather than going on to college, and so I did, and in the Air Force, the aptitude tests I took said that I had an inclination for data processing, and so they sent me to their electronics schools at Keesler Air Force Base, and I learned electronics in the Air Force, and I became an Atlas D missile man. I was actually I got to California by the Air Force, transferring me, putting me into the Strategic Air Command with the Atlas missile launch crews at Vandenberg Air Force Base. So that's how I made the transition, my first transition across country from New Jersey to California. When I got to Vandenberg, I spent 4 years working there in their various missile and satellite programs, and after my 4 years was up in 1966, I interviewed with IBM in the San Jose area, and they offered me a job. So I went to work for IBM. They moved me to the Bay Area, which at the time was not Silicon Valley. It was a valley full of apricot trees and Portuguese farmers. But the developers were soon to come in and take down the trees and build houses, and the semiconductor companies tended to house themselves there. Fairchild, National Semiconductor, AMD, a number of these semiconductor companies were coming from other parts of the country, Texas Instruments in Texas and so forth. And of course, there were startups like Intel, which was a startup there in Mountain View back in those days. So I, working for IBM, I had obviously got a lot of education in the area of computers and got associated with how things worked in those days. And it was pretty amazing times when you think back to the 60s and the 70s. What was going on in the country was, prior to those days, you couldn't own a computer. You could only rent computers from IBM, and you couldn't own telephones. You could only rent telephones from Ma Bell, and so consequently, there were monopolies that the government decided needed to be broken up and make things more competitive and available. And so with the breakup of these monopolies, we were able to buy our own phones, and the computer companies were starting up from IBM originally was NCR and became IBM, and then you had other companies like Bendix and making computers and selling computers. But the computers of the time were being sold principally to large corporation and government, and consequently, they were very expensive. They were called mainframe computers, and there were some associations that people that were working in the computer industry with these companies or the government belonged to. The IEEE was a electronics engineering company, and ACM was software people, and they would go to annually. They would have trade shows that these people were allowed to go to. They were invited to come to the trade shows and see the new computer products that were being introduced in the market. But the problem that you had was that you had to be a qualified participant to have to get into those shows, and so the general public was not invited to the shows. And the reason I point that out is that in my early endeavors after I left IBM, and I started a rep company selling electronic products in the Bay Area, which was becoming Silicon Valley, and selling those products, one of the companies that Repco took on was MITS, who was the manufacturer of the Altair computer, which was sort of hailed as the first personal computer in the industry, although there were other companies that were starting up in that area. The MITS Altair computer ended up on the cover of Popular Electronics back in 1976, and consequently it became a focal point for a lot of other startup companies to design their computers to be compatible with the MITS Altair. And so there was a standard bus configuration that was created by the MITS product that companies like Krememco and Processor Technology, Sol, and Horizon Computers, MSI Computer, all these other companies that were starting up in the area were adhering to this one standard, so that the people that were involved with computers could design products. Actually, they would design boards that would plug into any one of these computers, and typically the boards that you were plugging in would give you different applications. Krememco came up with a color graphics card that was called the Dazzler. There were people that were making add-on memory boards. There were speech cards that were made, and so forth. So if you were buying a personal computer at the time, you would want it to be S100 bus compatible. And once again, we saw that same sort of phenomena happen when IBM came out in the 80s. So, they probably did their homework on the early S100 bus standards. But the Repco, basically, as a sales rep company, we were the marketing and sales for the manufacturers. And there were literally, at the time, the Manufacturers Rep Association had divided the country up into 26 territories. And so the territory for Repco was Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and Northern Nevada. And then we would have another rep company that was friendly toward us down in Southern California and Southern Nevada area. And then there were Mountain State reps, and there were obviously East Coast and Southern states and so forth. And so how that worked is when we found a manufacturer that had a product in electronics and it was a good seller, we would refer that manufacturer to other rep associations in other areas. And when the Altair computer came along on the cover of Popular Electronics, one of my customers out at Stanford Research Institute had purchased one and told me that about the Altair. That's actually my first introduction to the computer, was a customer calling, complaining about the fact that I was selling him an Intel 8080 processor on a 4-inch circuit board for $1,200, and Popular Electronics was showing that same processor chip in a computer with a rack-mountable case, a power supply, and once again, it looked like a Data General Nova mini computer on the cover of that magazine. So consequently, my response to the customer was that for $439, it wasn't possible, and that it was a paper tiger, and that they should ignore that that wasn't a real thing. And about 3 weeks later, they called me up and asked me to come over to Stanford Research and help them unpack the paper tiger. It had arrived. So I did. When I went over there, I saw this Altair 8800 computer, couldn't believe my eyes, and basically got a hold of the manual and wanted to know about the company. And I got the information to call Ed Roberts, the founder of MITS in Albuquerque, and tell him that he was about to embark on a major problem if he didn't have sales reps and feet on the street all across the country, because Ed's company at the time was making 4-function calculator kits, and he was just bagging parts and sending them off to hobbyists so that they could assemble and solder their calculators together. And I told him that this computer was a whole different kind of animal, and that he needed to have a lot of support when he was going to be sending computer kits out to basically the hobby industry. That's what everybody buying personal computers at the time was classified as a hobbyist. And there were actually, because of the introduction and the advertising in the magazines that was going on, hobbyists were forming clubs across the country. And the first club that I was involved with was the Homebrew Computer Club in Palo Alto, California. And so computer clubs were coming about, and the hobbyists were exchanging ideas about their computer. They were doing software. They were making add-on boards, as I suggested earlier. And there was a thriving little business going on at these meetings that they were having. At the Homebrew Club, I would go there representing the MITS Altair people, and I would take copies of a newsletter that they put out every month, and I would pass them out at the show so people could keep up with what was going on with MITS and their products. Of course, the other thing that was pretty exciting about the Altair computer was that Ed Roberts not only recognized that he was going to have sales reps involved with his company, but he was also going to have some software development so that people that made these kits would be able to do something with them. And there were a couple of kids back in Harvard by the name of Bill Gates and Paul Allen that were going to school there, and they too had discovered this Popular Electronics magazine and decided that they wanted to write a basic interpreter for the Intel processor chip or the Altair computer. And so they contacted Ed Roberts as I did in becoming a sales rep for him, and they told him that they had 4K Basic running, on a Intel processor, and so Ed Roberts invited them to come to Albuquerque and demonstrate the product, and basically they did that, and he ended up hiring Paul Allen to become his in charge of software for MITS, and Bill Gates came along as a consultant, and their company, they formed a company called Microsoft, 2 words, and they licensed their BASIC to MITS for the Altair computer to be bundled with the sales of the computer kits. Their software would be bundled with it, would be sold with it. And as in your interview with Hal Ivey, by the way, he mentioned that he thought that we were the first people to license the Microsoft BASIC, and in checking into that, I found a Microsoft software tree is what it was, and it showed that the first 2 sales from Microsoft, 2-word company, prior to the change where they made Microsoft all 1 word. It was the first, the license that they had signed was to MITS, and the second one was to Exidy. So that's in the tree. And we actually, in your Floppy Days interview, Hal had talked about the fact that he and I went down to Albuquerque. Microsoft had a little office down there with a half a dozen employees, and the 2 of us went in there and signed the agreement with Bill Gates. Of course, Microsoft BASIC, we considered it to be standard BASIC at the time, and it was a version of the Dartmouth BASIC that they had created back there at the university and was available on many computers, the larger computers of the day. So here you were having a mini computer-like software language available on your microcomputer, and not having to have to purchase a mini computer, which was more in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. Our personal computers were in the $1,000 or under range, depending on whether they were a kit product or whether they were assembled and tested. And of course, assembled and tested computers became important because there were a lot of people that weren't hobbyists and weren't electronic oriented, and they just wanted to use the computer to do things. They wanted to play games with them. They wanted to do some business software. They wanted to do spreadsheets and word processing and other things that computers could do, but they had no capability to do the assembly of it. And that actually became an important part of a computer store operation. And what ended up happening, getting into the computer store thing, Boyd Wilson was my partner at Repco, and about 3 months after MITS got started in Albuquerque, they had a convention that they held there called the World Altair Computer Convention, and at this convention they invited all of their customers and their sales reps to come to Albuquerque. They were moving into new facilities, and they wanted to show off the products. And they also invited companies that were making products that would plug into that S100 bus. And so we all went off to this computer conference and that Altair was having. And when the reps got together and we met with Ed Roberts, he was talking to us about the marketplace and what we should be looking for in terms of customers in our territories. And he related a story about a person by the name of Dick Heiser. And Ed told us that Dick and his wife, who worked for Rand Corporation in Los Angeles, had started a computer store on Sepulveda Boulevard, and it was called Arrowhead Computer Store. And Dick had told Ed that he wanted to sell the Altair computers in the store, and how could we do that? And Ed and Dick came up with the idea that he should have 25% off the suggested retail price of the Altair computer, and that would be the profit margin that he would have as a retailer of the store. Now, Ed was paying sales reps a 5% commission for all the sales that were in our territory to support the product. And so consequently, when Boyd and I went out to get on the plane to go back to San Jose, I asked him what the name of our new computer store was going to be called, because obviously as soon as we land, we need to find a location to open up a retail store. And then as a rep, we would get 5% plus 35% of all of the computers that were being sold through the store, which at the time, there was a new magazine that had just come out for the personal computer people, and it was called Byte magazine. And I told Byte that I told Boyd that I thought a good name for our store would be Byte Shop. And so we went and opened up the first Byte Shop in Mountain View, California on El Camino Real. It was on my birthday in 1975 that we had the grand opening. And the Byte Shop computer store, we called it the Affordable Computer Store, and the trademark was Byte Shop, the Affordable Computer Store, because everybody thought when we mentioned to them about our retail store, the Byte Shop, they thought we were a bicycle shop. And nobody had really known of the word byte. It was very unknown out there in the industry. So we had to have a tagline, and of course the tagline we chose was the Affordable Computer Store. The other thing that I alluded to earlier in the conversation here was about these shows, the computer shows that were going on at the time. They were not open to the public, and these computer stores obviously were on Main Street, USA, and very public. And so one of the designs that we created for the Byte Shop stores was based on what we considered to be the greatest show on earth for computers, that people, the public now, would have some access to computers through the retail stores if they couldn't go to these conventions for the people associated in the computer industry. And obviously the next thing that was going to happen was that public computer shows were going to be created, which did happen in the Bay Area. It was called the West Coast Computer Faire. And that's actually where Apple Computer Company introduced their Apple II computer to the public, was at the first computer fair in San Francisco.
All right, that's it for Floppy Days number 127 for June 2023. And I want to give special thanks to Paul Terrell for his help with this podcast, for his willingness to be interviewed and provide such great information about the way things were in the late 70s and into the 80s. Paul has done so many wonderful things in his career, and it's so great to hear from him. I've provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Just go to floppydays.com for the full list. I strongly encourage you to provide feedback for the show. You can do that at Apple Podcasts. You can do it on the website. You can do it via email at floppydays@gmail.com. On Twitter, you can send feedback to @floppydays. On Mastodon, send it to @floppydays@oldbytes.space. Or on Facebook, you can post at facebook.com/groups/floppydays. Additionally, we have a Discord server, the link for which is at floppydays.com. And besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher.com, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye-bye.